Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I don't know if you've seen the book yet. Have you seen the book?
Yes.
Okay, you see it. It's an enormous book, a very daunting, and of course, immediately doorstop weapon for intruders. Right there, it is. Come to mind. However, it could have been a lot bigger. If they hadn't been very kind about the formatting, it would be much bigger still. The book goes way back in my past. I talk about the history of the book. When I was a teenager falling in love with Wagner, being very frustrated with the books that existed and wanting to do something much better and much more complete and much more, less like a tourist guide, something that really represented the reality. And then it sort of lay fallow, and it lay fallow into what we call shoeboxes, two enormous industrial boxes of physical cards, which I was supposed to bring tonight and forgot to bring some of them anyway, sorry. Cutting and pasting little things, and it just lay there for a long time. And then basically until COVID came, and I, with the urging, nagging, whatever you want to call it, of a very dear Bulgarian friend, the book came into being. And the thought process of the ideas in the book are mostly from now, but the material is largely from there. And I want to, before we start, before I'm going to invite my friend Tim to come up for a second, I just wanted to make one thing very clear. This is a very intimidating looking book. And if you thought that you were expected, in order to get what you need out of this book, to read every word, to look up every location list, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these, it's hard to imagine it would be very useful for the great majority of people. Some people, yes. It's not that that is not important. That's data. That's the foundation. If I'm doing a scientific research or economic research or whatever, you have to have the data to back up what you say. This is the data. This is the source material. And for those who are interested in like graduate seminars, things like that, or me, are very interested. I look up everything. I find new things. The book is not definitive. I found something while preparing for this talk. I mean, it's very open-ended because of the nature of the ring, which I'm going to talk about after. But I do now, I want to bring out my friend Tim Fisher for a second here on the podium, because without his help, he lived here, the book would not be. So please, Tim.
All right, so what I'm basically going to talk about is how the book came to be. Somewhere around, I guess we read, there was 96 or 97, the Met had a ring cycle, and Jeffrey was invited by WNYC to give a talk of about half an hour.
That's played the North Sea. That's right.
And the North Sea, whatever it was. But you did talk, and so so I somehow got a hold of his phone number or his email or something or other, and I said to him, "Do you know there's a Wagner Society?" And he said, "No." And so I said, well, try and get involved. And so that's what happened. And then, to make a long story short, he started mentioning this project that he had with Bobby Black, which he did in the 1970s, where he had listed all these ring cycle motifs. Somewhere around 2019 or 2018, finally buttonholed him and said, I want to see this thing. And I went to his apartment, and he pulled out these two large banker boxes, as they're called. He and Bobby had managed to totally disrupt about a dozen different piano vocal scores of the ring, and to clip out the bits that he wanted, paste them on the card, write out a list of the page numbers in Shermer where these were refound, just like the bread cup, and then write a little commentary. So I took one look at this thing, and I said, I think this needs to be digitized. We need to put it into some form that will be usable for other people, and we can do something with it. And I will point out that there are 930 examples in this book.
Well, but there are 20,198 measures in the ring, so
Right. And I picked up one example, which is the Magic Sleep, which is number 59, for example, on page 449.
This. That's a sort of definitive, that's the most common form. What he's referring to is the fact that there is a passage in Act 1 of Valkyria, which I don't have time to really look up, where it's hinted at. I'm going to talk about that premise.
Wonderful.
Thank you, sir. A lot of the challenge of the book was in a way summed up by a conversation I had with Peter at a Mets game this summer. Peter was talking about his love of Wagner, of course, but he said that he had a somewhat problematic relationship with the ring. because the ring is messy. That was his word. And I think the ring is kind of messy, but gloriously so, and all the more fast-ended perhaps. And I'm going to sum up why I think it's messy and how the book addresses this basic issue. When Wagner finished Lohengrin and was thrown out of Germany and had time to really think about things and to really watershed moment in his life, he wrote a lot of books, a lot of essays, Music and Drama, The Music of the Future, Communication to My Friends. And then he basically posits what he's going to do to opera, the opera of the future. And he posits two things. And I think the more important of the two things to him, the one that doesn't get talked about as much, is that he was going to write operas that would have the unity, the organic unity of a Beethoven symphony or a Beethoven string quartet. That all the music would fit together. Not just that it would be through composed, that it wouldn't stock with arias and a lot, but the music would all belong to each other and all relate to each other. And indeed, when Wagner finished Rheingold, the first person he wrote was his friend Rüffel in jail, to whom he said, I finished the first part, the prologue for my great trilogy. That's what he called it, tetralogy, we call it. But and every measure is related to every other one. And this was Wagner's great source of pride. So this is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is where the messiness arises. Now this side of the coin, the side of this incredible organic cohesion, this completely new and unique view of what opera, music drama could be, Wagner continued in Tristan, Meistersinger, and Parsifal, his other late works. These are not messy. They may have their messinesses too, but they're concise works about which you can make definitive statements. The Ring, it's not so easy, and this is why. The other part was that Wagner said he was going to write music for his operas, which would be specifically dramatic. In other words, no more of this typical thing you would do with Italian opera, where you would have a love duet and just plug in anybody's love. You didn't have to do the love duet from this opera. You could do a love duet from another opera. It just had to be a love duet. There's nothing very specific. He wanted music that was absolutely specific. And so he said, I'm going to write a work where the ideas, the music, the basic ideas of the text are presented clearly and ineffably in the music, preferably in the words, that would be first heard in the words, if not in the words, then in some very clear stage thing, like the appearance of Valhalla or the illumination of the Rheingold. Otherwise, like words, somebody says something and that and that stays in our mind. So it would be that way forever. Okay, here's the problem. I'm going to be moving to the piano very shortly. This is a very, very limited view of trying to write a piece. And it would very closely would become something along the lines of what all the Wagner commentators, his early commentators, and really right through the 20th century, typically tend to do. And affects the way I think that most of us have listened to the Ring. We learn a certain list of motives, say, oh, that's the sword motive, and that's the ring motive, and that's because after all, it's all clear, and we try to sort of plug them in. And that is absolutely not the process of how the Ring works. Because Wagner did not do, or he did not stay with what he started to do. First thing, because it evolves as he wrote the Ring over a period of 26 years. His style changes, his orchestration changes, his musical techniques change. The words stayed almost exactly the same, and the material has stayed the same, but his ideas of how to use the material. So the messiness of the Ring is that it has both of these things. It has an extremely specific dramatic content in the music. I could practically, out of the 21,900 and something measures, I could go pretty much measure to measure and tell you what specifically is being referred to in it, in a way that you can't do that with Tristan. I mean, it's all, but it doesn't have, imagine, I remember the early days they tried to do that with Tristan and the other ones. And you get things like love's peace, love's bliss, love's pain, love's agony, love's desire, love's fruition, etc., love's ecstasy. You know, it doesn't mean anything. Because they're musical themes that have a dramatic character, but not the specificity. But in the Ring, it has the specificity. So, but this specificity can also lead to an extraordinarily, wonderfully dynamic, because the themes take on the character, I would say, like characters in a great novel. And they change. They're still the same people, but they change. They change because they're in a different company, they're in a new place, they've gone so, and indeed, the idea of their change, very to a large extent, defies the story and the music as well. Now, one thing, the name of the book is The Music of the Ring. I'm a musician and I write about the music, but the nature of the music of the ring is such that you can never just write about the music because it is completely impregnated with the drama. Totally. So I'm going to go to the piano now. One more word about the nature of this book. Most of the real value of the book lies in the preface, I forget what I call it, introduction, the afterword, but especially in the comments and the examples. Now the examples you said 930, I thought 920, but it doesn't really matter. Examples. Now, of course, musicians or people who have some musical background can follow the examples. The examples are quite a lot longer than the examples are in most music books because I thought it was very important to give context. Since my whole point is these are not just labels. They are like characters they're changing movable things and interacting with other things. And unless you can show how they're interacting and changing, it loses the whole reason for it, the whole quality to it. On top of the work that he did for me, Tim has done another work which is completely his own doing, which is that he's made I don't know how to call it, a parallel where you can actually look up each and every one of the examples and listen to it. The timestamps for the Schulte ring. Now, this is all very casual. We have no copyright. This all has to be done just with friends. I'm not selling anything, but perhaps if people are interested, we could have emails and Tim get them.
See me after the thing if anybody wants to copy.
Yeah, I mean it's
77 pages.
Yeah, but it's something because now I don't think it's necessary even to hear them, even if you can't, because you can still glean from the comments what's going on, how they change. The most important thing about the leitmotifs in the ring is not what they are, but how they change. How they change, how they interact, and how they create this incredibly complex spiderweb labyrinth of things. The ring has a quality of a work in progress in a way, and that our response to it is that way. However far you go, there's always another, always another, always another. So let's start. It's very true that one of the advantages of playing it on the piano, as opposed to listening to a recording, is that I can simplify. The glory of the orchestra, the voices can kind of distract us. So there's something about the purity or the nakedness of the piano. So I just want to go to a very, very, very famous place. We're at the end of Das Rheingold, and we hear this. So probably everybody in this room would say, what would you say? Somebody want to say what this is? You'd say, it's the sword motive, right? What the problem is, there's no sword. Wagner was troubled by this, and in the earliest production lines, he said, well, let's have Wotan pick up a sword. An absolutely unbelievably horrible idea, by the way, just from the symbolic standpoint, to pick up a sword from that Fafner actually left from Alberic's sword, as if the magic sword came from Alberic's sword, anyway, and wave it in the air because we need something physical, because he's still locked in this music and drama idea. But then he dismissed it. He realized it's completely, entirely, not only unnecessary, but false. Actually, what this motive is, he says very clearly in the score, as if struck by a great thought. So this is the motive of Wotan's great idea. And the great thing about his great idea is it changes. The motive has a certain, and there's a second great idea, which is actually this motive. And the scene with Erda in Act 3 of Siegfried. And it comes up with almost as much fanfare as this one of these moments where everybody's going to notice it. The point being is that we all know, or those of us who study the ring at all, know that by the time he gets to the third act of Götterdämmerung, that's 25 years after. We all know that he evolved in his style. But I wanted to use this example to start my talk, because this is from Rheingold. This is composed in 1853, probably even before. So Wagner was already no longer thinking in terms necessarily of this completely A equals A, you know, this energetic C major arpeggio equals the sword when there is no sword. It's something much more. And one of the reasons why in the book I don't use names is because very often, as in this case, the name is not even really accurate. The main reason I don't use the names is that if we use names, names are stuck. A name is a name is a name, whereas a musical phrase is much, much more. On the other hand, it's extremely convenient. I have a list with most of the names, which I didn't want to put, but because it would make it as if the whole point of this book is that these motives are changeable, changing, dynamic things. By having a list that says this is this motive, this is this motive, it undoes it. But every single review that I've had from this book, and luckily they've all been good so far, has commented on how useful it is to have this list. So Tim was one of the people who told me I needed to have it. So I'm going to show you just now some examples of things that I think are really, really interesting that come out of the book that are not just a question of saying, oh, that's this motive and that's that motive. Yes, in the book, I identify 90 motives and then 46 in a secondary catalog, so what's 136 motives? It could have been 1,000, it could have been 30. It depends upon how, if you want to be very musicological, you could lump a lot of motives into one motive because they have strong characteristics in common. On the other hand, if you wanted to be very, very specific in the association, you could start splitting it up into thousands. So I picked a number. It's fairly arbitrary, actually, but there's a lot of them. But this is some of the things that I think are really, really of interest. And I want to start with probably the most famous unresolved mystery of the ring. That's what Derek Cook calls it at the beginning of his unfinished book, I Saw the World End. And it's this phrase. We hear it in scene 1 of Rheingold. And this is a very momentous place because the music hasn't sounded anything like this before. This is the very first time in the history of music that we hear Wagner tubas. So there's a whole new sonority. It makes a big impression. And this is one of those original motives that is introduced by the words. She says, nur wer der Minne Macht entsagt, nur wer der Liebe Lust verjagt, nur der erzieht sich den Zauber zu Reif, which means ring. In other words, only he who forswears love, only he who spurns love can make this ring. And just the page before, we've heard the ring for the first time. And indeed, this first instance of this motive goes into the ring. So we say, well, this is clearly, the motive is a renunciation of love. It's clearly about when we can't unsay that. I'm going to emphasize that because in today's world, it's mostly being unsaid. But you can't really unsay it. It is about the run. She says it is. It's in the words. The whole premise is that. Okay, and then just a little bit later in the same scene, just to kind of, we get it where a new concept with it with Albrecht when he actually takes the ring. Just a shortened version. He adds the word, so I curse love. So it's, you have to, you renounce love, you spurn love, and you curse love. Okay, so here's the great question. So let's move now to Walküre. Act 1, I think everybody probably knows what I'm going to be playing now. thrilling moment, he pulls the sword out of the tree. And he sings, the words basically says, most holy love's greatest need, from the most burning love's burning need. It's hard to translate Wagner. Burns in my breast. In other words, he's talking about love. He's talking about the acting out of the predicament, the need of love. Okay, so people say, well, golly, we haven't even heard this motive really since Rheingold. We only heard it a few times in Rheingold. Why is he singing it here? Has he forgotten what it meant? Now, by the way, that would be funny to say, except that commentators have said that many times about the later part of the Ring when he uses motives in ways that don't mean what they originally meant. He says, Wagner has forgotten. He didn't really, does anybody really think that Wagner forgot? That he doesn't, no. So why do we hear it? Why do we hear it? And now, there is a very strong current today, led by Roger Scruton, who's a wonderful Wagner writer, who say, no, see, this is the point is it's not really the motive of renouncing love at all. It's the motive of making definitive decisions. Albrecht was making a definitive decision, and now Siegmund is making a definitive decision. Okay, but the problem is and then she says specifically renounce love. You can't unsay that. Besides which, as I'm going to point in just a second, I'm going to play something. There's a lot of other music that also talks about definitive decisions. So I think that that's not the right answer. The right answer lies in what the nature of music, real music, is about, in which Wagner is using the leitmotifs to express sort of magnified. Music is about remembering and comparing. If you listen to the Eroica gains enormous strength because we remember how it sounds the first time we hear the themes, and then they change. We said, wow. And even the tiniest, it goes from to the very end. It's not a big deal, but every time I hear it, I burst into tears because it's so great in the context, right? Well, Wagner picks up on that. So what is the reality of this is that we remember. We said, gosh, look what the Rhine Maidens described, and look what Albrecht did, cursing love. And here's this other guy who to the same music is saying, no, I'm going to risk everything on love. In other words, we compare and we contrast. We remember. Wagner never used the term leitmotif, but he did say moments of feeling and remembrance. Moments of feeling, remembrance, and anticipation. That's another thing we'll get to in a second. Now, every single time we hear this renunciation motive, and I might as well call it that, that's what it was the first time, we have a different memory. For instance, when Wotan sings it, end of, he's also doing something definitive, right? He's kissing her to sleep. I continue because I think it's really important to understand these in terms of the context. When the Rhine Maidens sing it, it goes into the Ring music. When we hear it, when Siegmund sings it, it goes into this incredible apotheosis of Wotan's great idea, which is first manifested in the sword as he pours the sword out. When Wotan sings it here, in the moment where he's forced to say goodbye to the great love of his life, his daughter Brunhilde, we hear this, which is usually called magic sleep, but in the course of the Ring will lose completely its character of magic sleep. That's what it seems like here, and it seems to have to do with transformation. And Wotan is undergoing a huge transformation at this moment, actually, beginning. So, and then the very last time we hear it, this way as well, we hear it so seldom, we have. This is Brunhilde refusing to give up the ring. Now, this is also, we compare and contrast, because she, of course, is refusing to give up the ring because the ring to her stands for love. But of course, she's making a horrible mistake. Yeah. She's dooming both herself and Siegfried in this single moment. And this music is full of anger towards Wotan, whom's her main name. All this Wotan music's around it. So the surroundings are very important. So going back now to this idea of music that can't be explained. I had a whole long list, but I don't have time to do them, but I'm going to give one at least. A lot of other places where the music can only be explained because we compare it to its original use and we see how different it is. And people are making definitive statements in their lives because of it. So let's first think of this. This is, of course, the ring motive, which we hear a lot. It's very flexible, and it doesn't hurt to call it the ring motive, really, because it stands for a whole lot of things. The ring itself is such a complicated symbol. And there's another thing that's attached to it, which is something which also was introduced in Reingold with words. It says, giving up women's love and beauty. It's related to renunciation initially, because renunciation is the act and it's the result. A loveless world. It's lovelessness, abandoning love. And that combination is about as bleak a combination as we have it a lot in the ring. We hear it especially a lot in Gunnar Dagwood, but we hear it before too. So here's a passage from the third act of Valkyria. To me, maybe one of the top 10 passages for dramatic and musical importance in the entire cycle. And Brunhilde is justifying herself to Wotan, why she disobeyed him. And the music is full of this. It's very complicated. My book talks about this, but it's all music that has to do with Wotan's struggles. The spear is there and his frustration, they call it. But it's very, very involved with Wotan's struggles. She's picked up on her father's struggles. So let's just play this passage. Okay, let's try. I played a lot, but I think it's important to have the context again. So we hear this. And what she says is, I only recognized one thing, that I had to make a choice, and I had to choose love. And then when she says, and you who breathe love into me, you, Wotan, your daddy, you breathe this love into me. And we hear this new motive. It's actually, we've heard it before, but the first time we hear it in the major, which is also, all this music is about the spear, by Wotan's evolving power. So this is another way, by the way, that this very dynamic view of motives tells the story. Because Wotan's spear, we talk about the ring in terms all the time of power versus love, as if power and love in the ring were single-minded, single units. The concept of power, the concept of love changes, evolves all through the ring. We can only really understand the ring as we understand the change, the evolution of these things. And this passage we are supposed to remember. Yes, Albrecht took the ring and cursed love. She is risking everything to embrace love. So just as much as, that's why you can't call the renunciation motive the motive of definitive decision, because this is another definitive decision. Now, I was going to give a bunch of examples from other motives that do the same thing. They come back in places where you can't think, why in the world do we hear this here? It has nothing to do with it. But it does if we compare. We say, wow, what I was going to do, I'll just do very quickly. This. So the motive that we first hear, it's a combination, it's a distorted Valhalla with the distorted Rheingold. And it's Wotan cursing his power and saying, I don't want it anymore. I'm disgusted. I'll leave my world to the Nibelungen. He's had a son. I've heard from him, and this and that and the other. And we hear it a lot, and also not a lot. It's actually pretty seldom we hear it, but we hear it with Wotan's disgust, and then we hear it with both Hagen and then Alberic and Götterdämmerung, their triumph. Okay, that all makes sense. It's all about that. But then we hear it with, I might as well play it since I do have it. We hear it in the third act of Götterdämmerung with Siegfried, with the Rhine maidens. He's playing along, and he says, I'm not going to give you the ring. I would have given you the ring for love, but I'm not going to give you the ring because you're threatening me. I'm afraid I'll have to do it by memory. Okay, that's fine. And it goes right back into the typical Rhine maiden scene music. Why? Well, because we're forced to compare. Wotan, faced with losing the ring and the world and everything, gives up in disgust and says, let evil take over. Siegfried, who has been offered the ring, says, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. I don't want it. In other words, it's a compare. Again, Siegfried's not right, of course, but it's a way of comparing. It's also a way, the music stays in our head. It comes back and it evolves, and that's also very important, just the presence, the return of the music. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Okay, I want to just go on to a few other completely different aspects. This is the aspect of how motives change in meaning. One other one I'd like to do because it's such an important one, such kind of an obvious one. We hear, that's another one of the motives that's associated with words, Rheingold, Rheingold. We hear it with the Rhine maidens singing in lots of ways. And we hear it when Siegfried comes out of the cave because he's got their gold, fine. That all makes sense, it's changed, but that's okay. We haven't heard it in a long, long time. So then let's move to the third act of Siegfried, and we have Siegfried starting to fight with his dad, leading to the destruction of the spear, going through the fire. We have and this. Becomes part of a combination of a lot of motives together, which associated with Siegfried going to the fire. Very, very exciting. Why the call of Rheingold? Why the call of Rheingold? Well, because the call of Rheingold has changed meaning now. It's not changed, it's evolved, extended. He is making a comparison between the innocent joy of the Rhine maidens over their gold with Siegfried's innocent joy, wiping out Wotan and going through the fire, and then ironically, he'll use it with terrible, vicious irony, in Götterdämmerung, when Siegfried, with the same kind of innocent joy, unfortunately, will go back through the fire in the service of Hagen's plot and disguised as Gunther, which of course is a horrible thing to do, but we hear it ironically the same thing. In other words, he sort of adopts it. So the motive evolves. It's not that it stops being Rheingold. Rheingold, it's always Rheingold, Rheingold. It's in our head, but the meaning of it becomes more and more expanded. One of the most important characteristics of the ring, which very much differ it from the late Wagner operas, is how much of the ring is spent in telling stories, which I call narrations. There's a lot of reasons for it. And for instance, in Tristan, there's one. In Götterdämmerung, there's one and kind of a half. In the ring, there's lots, and they typically are very, very long and important. Some of them are very short. I mean, like Loga's little narration in scene 2 of Rheingold. Some of them are whole scenes, like the Mima Wanderer scene, Act 1 of Siegfried, or the Waltraud narrative, or Siegfried's tale, Siegfried's narration. And they're absolutely essential to this concept I have of these evolving motives, because they take things from the past. They're essential for other reasons too, by the way, but they take motives from the past that we haven't heard necessarily in a long time and put them in the context of new. So they gain new meaning. And we learn things not only about them that we didn't know, but we learn things about the new ones because they are related to them. That makes sense? So there are moments of a lot of revelation. The narration scenes, one of the things in my book, the last chapter, I suggest a whole lot of further courses of study. And one of them is somebody should write, me maybe, a big book on the narration scenes in The Ring, how they work. They have all kinds of characteristics. For instance, one of the things he does in almost all of them is he has these little formulas, combinations, complex of motives that appear or relate in the scene, but are used very abstractly, almost like Bach would put together 4 or 5 themes together. And sometimes they can be simple, like in the Nord scene. So that's just 2 motives, but and the Wagner scene is like 6, I think. But they have structural reasons, but they also have this way of creating more and more binds, more and more sort of. It becomes, by the time we get to the end of Götterdämmerung, of course, we're dealing with this just like this labyrinth of connections and things, which is both perplexing but also incredibly glorious. Now, I want to jump now because I'd like to get to this last subject. Well, I wanted to talk about another thing which I'm very fond of, and I talk about a lot in the book. I'm really interested in how does Wagner use the motives to create formal divisions. One of the ways is like in the Norns, in these formulas I talked about in the narrations. Wagner has this fondness for what I call bookends, which is he will take divisions, dramatic divisions or scenes or important things, and have them start and end with the exact same music. But he does it in countless scenes. He does it in the Wanderer scene. He does it in Wotan's monologue. He does it in the love duet in Götterdämmerung. He does it in the Todesverkündigungsszene, the big scene with Siegmund and Brunhilde in Act 2 of Walküre. He does it a lot. And it's a way of setting them off, sort of like it has a beginning and it has an end. It's kind of artificial. In other words, it's a rather abstract way of using the motives, but they generally have some kind of a tie-in. But I wanted to end on talking about a subject which I think is very important because Wagner himself wrote more than once, but he wrote especially to Liszt once and then to Matilda von Wesenach while composing Tristan, that he considered his greatest gift to be for transition. And I think we've all remember hearing that. And what Wagner means by transition is, I think, 2 things. Transition in a musical sense, particularly if a composer is talking about transition, is how do I get from one formal section to another formal section? How do I get from, for instance, if it's sonata form, how do I get from the first theme to the second theme, for instance? Transition, of course, in a strictly theatrical sense, is how do I get from one world to another world? And one of the things that most fascinated me in this book, and which I think is really grounds for study, is how does Wagner create these transitions? If he's so good at it, why hasn't anybody studied what does he do to make them? And he very strongly uses his motivic techniques to create these transitions, to get from one thing. One of the things he typically does in almost all of them is he uses repetition. If you repeat the same elements over and over again, then you follow them over a long period of time, and let's say as they get softer and softer. There's many great transitions in The Ring. One of the great transitions to me in The Ring is how we get from the incredible exuberant excitement of Siegfried going through the fire to this awestruck scene at the top of the mountain, which is completely quiet and has this very, very high music, which is in Siegfried very noticeable because Wagner is very carefully written, especially the first act, all very low. And the orchestra bassoons and violas and stuff, and it goes up really high. So how does he get from one to the other? Well, to really show it, I could play the whole passage if you're going through the fire, but I'll just play the last part, and we'll follow. He has a combination of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different motives. This one, which is usually, I think, inaccurately called, well, what's it called? Brunhilde's Sleep. It does have to do with Brunhilde, certainly. Which is Siegfried the hero, a heroic motive. We have this, the Rheingold. Now referring to Siegfried, we have, which is for no particular reason usually called Fate. There's no reason I can see why it should be called that, but it's as good as anything else. Anyway, so I'll just play this very last snippet. So it's gone from being very, this is going to get in the way. Very, very loud. So I'm just going to start loud. Sorry, folks. Okay. Come in and he's on top of the mountain. This fantastic transition coming down, and really basically just does the same thing over and over again with these incredible modulations from one thing to another. Another kind of transition is from the third act of Götterdämmerung, so we're going to the end, and this also is in this is in the context of one of the narrations. It's in Siegfried's narration when he starts remembering his life. And this one also introduces one of the ideas I have in my book, which I've never really read anyone else talk about, which is my idea of motivic surrogates. A motivic surrogate is a motive that seems to take the place of a motive. One motive sort of drops out or seems to drop out and something else takes its place. It dramatically or musically or both sort of functions in the same way. It can be very complex. This can take us pretty far afield. But just there's a very important motive in both Valkyrie and Siegfried. It comes in a lot of forms, but that's one of the most common. Associated, I think, initially mostly with Sieglinde, and then with Siegfried dreaming about his mother. It kind of takes on a general association with certain aspects of the Welsings themselves, and then in Götterdämmerung, it disappears. We don't hear it in the prologue, we don't hear it in Act 1, we don't hear it in Act 2, but what we do hear is we hear it's very similar, right? It has that leap of the sixth, which is the big thing. Anyway, that gets into my book a little bit too much. So we have not heard this in a long time. So now Siegfried is, he's in his very sort of bumptious way. We're starting to see a more and more positive side of him as he has that wonderful toast to Mother Earth. And then Hagen says, tell us the story of your life. So we have to go from this kind of world to the magic of Siegfried's return to the forest. And when he returns to the forest, we'll hear the forest music again, but it won't be the same as it was, because we hear it before. In the forest, the strings are legato on the strings, but we'll hear when this comes in now, the strings are staccato. It's the tiniest thing, but Wagner is just a magician in creating this sense of enchantment with the smallest change. So we're going to hear the return of come back at this, start this passage. starts singing. Siegfried is in the forest again. This is like a magician, how he takes us from one world to another. And then he's going to take us, at the end of it, one world back. And what he's going to use to come back to this other world is the return of Brunhilde's theme. He's reintroduced this, but now he's going to tell us, he does this all the time. When he has these relationships, he shows us, he makes something which has been kind of lying potential, and he makes it real. So let's start. This is, Hagen is giving Siegfried the potion to make him remember now. So we'll hear. And now the answer. Now he's back with Brunhilde. And then, of course, we know what's going to happen now. He's going to get murdered. So he takes us. It's amazing how he takes us back into the forest, and then as it grows, this transition into this much more passionate music of the love music, and then he's back with Brunhilde. So he does it with the same. You're making signs to me. I know I'm done. He does it using in this case also combinations of motives in sequential ways, but also by bringing things back, by something that we haven't heard in a long time, relating it to something we've heard now. And then all of it gains this tremendous luminosity. This is one example of literally thousands, tens of thousands. So in the book, you can follow as much as you want, or on the level that you want, these magnificent, almost magical transformations, where he also reveals not only things about the greatness of his music, but the greatness of the story and the magic of the whole experience. So yes, The Ring is messy, but it's a wonderful mess. Thank you.